with Celeste Warren. She's the Vice President of Global Diversity and Inclusion Center of Excellence at Merck. As the leader of their Global Diversity and Inclusion COE, she's responsible for working with Merck's global leaders to advance and embed D&I throughout the organization to enhance the employee experience and maximize business performance at the same time. And prior to joining Merck in 1997, Celeste worked for 9 years in human resources at Kraft Foods and General Foods. And she's been honored with many awards, including Black Enterprise's Top Executives in Global Diversity and Inclusion, Savoy Magazine's Most Influential Women in Corporate America, Women's E-News 21 Leaders of the 21st Century, Diversity Global Magazine's Influential Women in Global Diversity, and she's also a member of CNBC's Workforce Executive Council and World 50's Inclusion and Diversity Impact Community. We're very fortunate, obviously, to have her with us today, and she's going to be talking to us about diversity and inclusion and the path forward in 2021. So everybody, please join me in welcoming Celeste Warren. Celeste, go ahead. It's all yours. Take the virtual floor.
Thank you, Bobby. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can hear you great.
Okay. Well, thank you for the opportunity to talk with everyone about diversity and inclusion. And I'd like to just take a few minutes to give you an overview of some thoughts around the path forward for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then I'd like to open it up for any questions that may be coming from the audience. So I thought I'd talk a little bit about what has been happening across the globe. And then very importantly, the impact that it's had on diversity and inclusion, and then how it's shaping our future. And then last thing I'd like to just touch on are some insights for life and what I call this next normal. It's not going to go back to the way things were, but it's the next evolution of how things will be. We know that 2020 was a very challenging year. And we also know that external trends in diversity and inclusion have had an impact on our diversity and inclusion strategies across our organizations. External trends such as workforce of the future is increasingly more diverse, more global, the onset of different generations in the workplace, different dimensions of diversity in all the different areas of diversity. It's just becoming more and more diverse. And then economic inclusion is going to continue to grow in importance, and our ability to look outside of our four walls and do things to ensure that we're making an impact on the economy as an organization. Third, corporate social activism is going to increase as a competitive advantage. When individuals are looking at companies for which they want to join and they start interviewing, one of the things that they look at, they want to see that that corporation has the same ideals and values that they have as an individual. This has more increasingly become a role that is played in how candidates are selecting companies. All of these external trends has an impact on D&I. The increased inclusion efforts as we accommodate our employees through an evolution of the workplace. We've seen that we have needed to think very differently about how and where work is done, especially in the past year. There's more nuanced skills that are required by leaders in order to lead a more dynamic workforce. We know that those leadership skills and capabilities that were needed in the past, now there are new skills that are needed. Those things that we sort of characterized as soft skills, those skills are imperative moving forward, as an example. And then there's a sharp increase in employee engagement, dialogue, and the demand for empowerment and social responsibility of the company. Their employees are demanding that that corporations speak their truth and speak up around various different issues that are impacting social responsibility, also economic inclusion, and all of those different things that are making an impact on the world externally. So what does that mean when we look to the future? What does it mean for diversity and inclusion? Well, we know that there's increased emphasis in corporate social activism. Investors, shareholders, and employees are demanding more from companies in the way of social and people responsibility. I've been called more and more into investor meetings where they're asking questions around the company's posture around diversity and inclusion. And so this is becoming more and more important. Fighting the reaction to COVID-19, there's been more D, and in this case, distancing, and less I, inclusion. We have seen over the past year when the pandemic hit, we saw countries closing their borders. We saw corporations sending their employees home to work virtually. So there was that separation and distance from their colleagues in the workplace. We also saw at an individual level, individuals that were social distancing and remaining 6 feet apart in order to stay healthy and thwart the pandemic. And so all that emphasis on distancing and separation, we know we need to make sure that we are applying inclusion and really working harder with inclusive behaviors and making sure that we have that in our arsenal of leadership behaviors and making sure that we're working inclusively as many of us have been working in this inclusive environment. So that becomes really, really important. So we have to counteract the distancing across individuals, organizations, and borders and really focus on inclusion. Those leadership and people manager capabilities, people managers and leaders are going to need to learn to lead in a much more dynamic work environment with more engaged and empowered employees. They're basically you're seeing that as we work from home, we have our televisions on, we have our iPads on, and we're seeing those 24-hour news cycles. And the external world is now intertwined with our work environment, which is our home. And so we're seeing all of the news and all of the things that are happening around the globe. And that is having an impact on us. And we have ideas and we have beliefs around those different things that are happening in each of the communities by which we identify. And so it becomes really, really important that leaders not close their doors and close their virtual doors from the standpoint of being able to engage with their employees around some of these things that are happening. We have to be able to have those bold and inclusive conversations. I remember years ago that we used to say, you don't talk about, religion in the workplace and politics in the workplace. But now in this day and age, you can't have that philosophy. As long as it is aligned with the values and standards of your organization, these types of conversations are needed in order to get past the discomfort and have the conversations around inclusion and engagement. But you have to have those conversations and acknowledge some of these differences that come from the different perspectives from different organizations and different people in those organizations because of the communities from which they come. There's changes in how we reach our customers and patients. In our world, when we think about healthcare, there's been an influx of telemedicine and virtual health. And we know that many patients now, you're reaching your doctor through your computers and you're having those conversations with them. And that's not unlike other aspects too, when we think of how our shopping habits and we're buying everything online now, our groceries, everything. And so this influx of technology, we have to make sure that we know that there are gaps when it comes to technology in certain communities. In our industry, in the healthcare industry, we know that there are certain patients that they don't have that technology. And so we need to make sure that as we really look at technology and how we go about our day-to-day activities and how we go about establishing our businesses and our behaviors, that it doesn't further widen the gap between the haves and the have-nots, those that don't have the opportunity to have that technology. in those underrepresented communities around the globe. So we have to make sure that we're continuing to look at that and not widen that gap. And then lastly, resiliency. Resiliency is an imperative. We have to make sure that we're leveraging our diverse employees to strengthen the organizational resiliency that is needed during this time. Everyone had to, in a matter of days, turn from working in their work environments to working virtually. And so with that came a very strong sense of need of resiliency. And an organization is only as strong as its individual employees. And each of us as individual employees demonstrated that resiliency. And so that is going to become an imperative moving forward in all organizations. At Merck, within our organization, it becomes really important that we look at diversity and inclusion through a lens that is encompassing and holistic within the organization. And we feel that we're coming off a time of where D&I was amplified because of the situation that we were in, the pandemic, the xenophobia that was happening in the Pan-Asian community, the social unrest and the civil unrest as a result of the murder of George Floyd and Breonna Taylor and many others in the Black community, and the different things that were happening around the globe with LGBTQ rights and rights that were happening as far as nationalism in some of the countries. And so we want to make sure that we're compelling a more globally diverse and more inclusive workforce for our employees by creating an environment around the employees of belonging, engagement, equity, and empowerment, so that we can ensure that our patients experience ultimate health outcomes. And it's in 4 areas that we have to make sure that we're paying attention when it comes to diversity and inclusion. That's in strengthening the foundational elements of diversity. And that involves, very importantly, just making sure that we have a diverse workforce that mirrors the diversity in our patient base and our customer base. And then secondly, we want to surround those employees with a culture of inclusion. And that means that ensuring that all of our leaders and our people managers understand the importance of that. Third, very importantly, at that intersection of diversity and inclusion and business performance, you do create a competitive advantage for the organization. And so we have to continue to leverage diversity and inclusion to ensure business value, which is very, very critical. And then lastly, we want to make sure that we're looking outside of the 4 walls of the organization to share best practices and learn from other organizations so we can together transform the external environment, the culture, and the business landscape. Some insights for life in the next normal. We know that the leadership skills that we have around listening with empathy, psychological safety, unconscious bias, we have to make sure that we are demonstrating those skills because they are needed more than ever. Make sure that you are able to build your skills around diversity and inclusion, so you can role model those skills. You can lead inclusively. You can have intentionality around how you're leading in your respective organizations. And so having those as fundamental skill sets around diversity and inclusion are very, very critical. Secondly, don't be afraid to be authentic. Don't be afraid to show your vulnerability. That's going to become even more and more important as we move forward, because the aspect of leading authentically is going to be so needed. People need to see and understand that they can relate to you as a leader, as someone who is either a project manager or whatever your role might be. It becomes so important that you display that authenticity. It is so apparent when people see that you don't exhibit and demonstrate that authenticity. It's so very, very clear that you become less credible as a leader. And it becomes also very clear because people, they know when someone is not being authentic. They know when there's spin going on. They know when there's a lack of transparency. And so it becomes so very, very critical for the leaders of the next normal to be able to be authentic, to not be afraid to show that vulnerability, to not be afraid to say, I don't know, but I can try to find out and let's learn together. It is almost impossible for everyone to know about every single culture, every single background, every single community that everyone identifies in. But you can also educate yourself through many different tools and resources online that are so available. So educate yourself and then learn from others. I'm always asked about, how can I do that? How can I build my skills and capabilities around diversity and inclusion? And you can do that by first learning on your own, reading books, reading articles, getting different viewpoints from that perspective and building your own capabilities. And then secondly, reaching out to someone who you trust, a friend, a colleague, and who identifies differently than you do, and having that conversation with them, being able to engage with them and be authentic, and make sure you pick someone who's going to be truthful and candid with you so you can learn and listen and be able to have that candid conversation. And then after that, reach out and build your network and learn and talk with others who identify differently than you do and build that network out. And as you do that, you'll become more and more confident and comfortable in being able to have those uncomfortable conversations. You'll feel more comfortable in being your authentic self. Third, stay relevant. And I mean to stay relevant from the standpoint of not just the skills and capabilities, your functional skills and capabilities, from the standpoint of what you need, whether you're a marketer or a salesperson or an engineer, whatever your functional skills and capabilities may be, stay relevant from that standpoint of not just the skills that are needed today, but are needed in the future, but stay relevant around the skills that are needed to be an ambassador for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And again, going out, reading articles, understanding, build your toolbox and your toolkit with materials and skills and capabilities so you can be a better leader when it comes to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And then lastly, I would always say, elevate your voice. When you're in certain forums, whether that be senior leader meetings, whether that be town halls, employee business briefings, any type of meeting or setting, elevate your voice. Be an ally for not just one, and not just some, but for all. Be an ally for any group that identifies differently than how you identify. And what I mean by that, you can demonstrate that in many different ways. If you're sitting in a meeting and you realize and see that someone perhaps has been marginalized in the meeting, you can acknowledge that. And something as simple as the fact that someone's idea was passed over and not explored, you can raise the person and bring them into the discussion by saying, John, I see that you raised a point. It's pretty important. Can you elaborate on it? So that's an example of advocating for a person. Another example is if you're in a meeting and you're talking about some of the talent in the organization, advocating for those persons that maybe wouldn't get a say or wouldn't be able to talk about their skills and their capabilities and why they're able to have a promotion or take on a different assignment. Be able to advocate for the person in that type of setting. And then third, you can also be an advocate for someone in a lot of different other situations as well, because there are people, when you elevate your voice and you have the confidence to be able to speak, you're speaking not just for yourself, but you're speaking for hundreds, maybe thousands, maybe tens of thousands of others who haven't yet found the confidence to speak and elevate their own voice. And so however you identify, make sure that you're elevating your voice for, if you won't do it for yourself, do it for those in your community that haven't yet found their voice. And that becomes really, really critical. I've been in situations where For example, it's a women's roundtable discussion with senior leaders. And I found that sometimes, what the woman might say, well, I haven't experienced that. And they may say that. And yes, if that is the case, which, I doubt maybe that it is, we've all experienced bias in some way, shape, or form or another. We're all human and we've experienced it and been on the other side of it. But if that's been the case for you, then speak for the thousands of other women who haven't had the experience that you have, and they've had that experience of being marginalized or felt that way. And so elevate your voice for them, because it becomes really, really important that you're doing that and able to do that. And so lastly, I just want to be able to say that when we think about diversity and inclusion and the path forward, it is continuing to be amplified. It's going to continue to be in the forefront of corporations and their strategies. It's going to continue to be in the forefront of leadership capabilities and abilities. It's going to continue to be in the forefront of our business strategies and how we move forward. It's going to have to be integrated into the alpha to the omega of your business strategies, your marketing strategies, your commercial and sales strategies, your manufacturing strategies, your merger and acquisition strategies. It's going to have to be integrated into those strategies. And very importantly, because that is what the world is calling for us to do. They're calling for corporations and leaders in corporations to be those advocates, to take up the mantle and be able to move forward with a lot of these different issues that some in the communities have not been able to push forward. And so the spotlight is on these corporations to be social activists and really be able to help to amplify and move diversity and inclusion forward. It's being requested by our employees, by our shareholders, by investors, to not just drive the top line and the bottom line of the performance, but also the performance as it pertains to diversity, equity, and inclusion. And with that, I'd like to turn it over and then answer any questions that you might have.
Okay. Yeah, we do have a few questions, and a couple of them actually are, might sound like I'm babbling a little bit. I'm just trying to lay the groundwork for the actual question with it. So bear with me if it sounds like I'm just rambling on with a couple of the questions. But the first one regarding the increased emphasis in corporate social activism, is the emphasis equally divided or weighed, distributed, whatever you want to call it, internally and externally for social and people responsibility?
Oh, that's a great question, and absolutely. And so I will give the example within our organization as far as healthcare, the healthcare industry and the pharmaceutical industry. We have an obligation to make sure that within the employee, within the corporation, that we have a diverse employee base that is representative from all the dimensions of diversity. Because we know that when we bring those different perspectives that come as a result of having diverse employees at the table and when you're discussing, you will have a better outcome. The external research has shown it time and time again, when you have diverse teams, that you will have a stronger business performance. So there's that obligation to meet the needs of our employees, to make sure that we have fundamentally a diverse employee base, and making sure that we don't just have a diverse base, but we also are making sure that we're leveraging that diversity by creating an inclusive environment, an environment of psychological safety where people can speak their minds, where they can come to work and be authentic and be able to contribute and add value to the business, and also be able to bring their functional skills and capabilities, but also their cultural skills and their cultural experiences to be able to bridge the gap and help us to drive our business. And then just as equally important as it is to make sure that we're driving diversity, equity, and inclusion within the organization, we have to make sure that we're also looking outside and sharing what we know with other organizations, but also looking at what we need to be doing. And in our space, within Merck and in the pharmaceutical industry, health equity. We know there are disparities with patients around equity when it comes to health. And so we know that we need to be going out into those underserved, undervalued, underfunded communities and being able to bridge that gap and help them to understand and educate them on, educate us too on what are some of those barriers that are getting in the way of our patients being able to experience ultimate health outcomes. And so being able to bridge those gaps becomes really, really important. Global supplier diversity, making sure that we are partnering with minority and women-owned organizations, suppliers, and small companies to help them, because the largest where we're seeing the impact in jobs, those companies are the ones that are hiring and being able to expand it, even in this economy with the pandemic. And so being able to make sure that we are responding and partnering with these suppliers is helping to build jobs. It's making an impact, an economic impact on our economy. So it becomes really, really important that you're doing both the things you need to be doing within the four walls of your organization, but also outside in the communities to be able to really, really, truly drive diversity, equity, and inclusion. Great question.
Yeah, no, and a fantastic answer as well, and kind of stole some of the thunder from my follow-up question to that. But I could see how that would help with talent initiatives as well. When people see that, that seems to be kind of something that people are looking for when they're trying to decide on where they want to go for employment and if they want to stay as well. But in follow-up to that, you had mentioned how critical it is to leverage diversity and inclusion to ensure business value. And you explained it in a little bit of depth there with the last question. And I don't know if you're able to do this or not, but how do you qualify that driving business value of leveraging diversity and inclusion?
Well, I think very importantly, we need to look at how we drive value from the standpoint of our business. So again, I'll use our example. Our LGBTQ employee business resource group, for example, works very closely with our HIV franchise in helping to understand what some of the barriers or obstacles are. What are those items that are getting in the way of the patients in the LGBTQ community? And so our HIV franchise really leverages that employee business resource group to understand some of those challenges so they can put strategies together to help to drive that. And so I would say that how you evaluate how successful you are is through our revenue for that franchise. And so, what was our revenue? What did it look like before we began the engagement and this particular strategy? And what were some of the outcomes afterwards? And so very importantly, we have to know, as D&I practitioners, we have to know what keeps our business leaders up at night, what's on the forefront of their minds, and be able to apply interventions to help them from that perspective. Another example, when we launched Gardasil, which was the HPV vaccine years ago, there was a challenge because we were talking about getting that vaccine out to girls 12, 13, 14 years old. And so as a parent, you can shudder and think, I don't know if I wanted to have that conversation with my daughter at 12, 13, 14 about why I think she should have this vaccine. And so we engaged. There was a series of religious groups that were a bit concerned about how we were going to be marketing this. And so, we engaged with our interfaith employee business resource group and talked with them and had discussions with them about this. And it helped us to put a marketing campaign together that really helped us to be able to understand the sensitivity with launching this product. So there's so much, I can give you example after example after example, but I just think it just becomes really critical that we understand the role that D&I plays in business performance.
Yeah, no, it's clearly something that is still lacking. I mean, a year later from some of these unfortunate incidents that led to the discussion moving a little bit more to the forefront, it's critical to keep that going. And I know we're just about out of time, but I wanted to ask you one more quick question. When you were talking about leadership capabilities and the managers, how they need to learn how to do things, in a much more dynamic work environment. So I'm not sure, what your return to work strategies are or how much they're going to change, but are the initiatives going to be affected at all when people get back into the office? Is it going to be a whole different dynamic when these people are having these diversity, equity, and inclusion discussions with people sitting around them rather than just on a screen?
Yeah, I think there's going to be an aspect of that, Bobby. Absolutely. But I honestly feel that sometimes it's easier to be on social media and give an opinion. It's a harsh opinion, and that's great when you're sort of almost anonymous. And the virtual aspect of it, talking face to face, it's still a screen there, so it's a little
Right.
bit still. But yeah, when you bring people face to face to have these honest and these conversations, I honestly think that there's going to be more inclusive conversations from the standpoint of, let me try to listen with empathy. Let me try harder to do that. And not just to get my point across, but to listen with empathy and see if there's common ground in what we're talking about. And I think that's going to be really critical. And we've been engaged with Mary Frances Winters and with the Winters Group and her Bold Inclusive Conversations. And we've been conducting workshops on a weekly basis, open to anyone who wants to participate since June of last year, so they can understand the frameworks by which you have these conversations. And we've been strongly encouraging our people managers to go through it, because it's really, really critical if we're going to have those conversations around diversity, inclusion, politics, religion. All of those different things are going to be really, really important moving forward, as we evolve diversity, equity, and inclusion in the workplace.
Yeah, no doubt. I appreciate that. It was a fantastic discussion. Never seen another keynote when 30 minutes just clearly does not seem to be enough. But love the insight today, in talking more about the internal and external components of it to drive business value. We got religion involved in the conversation. Really appreciate it today and what all these events mean for diversity, equity, and inclusion as we move forward through 2021. So on behalf of everybody in the audience and us here at Opal Group, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thank you for having me. Take care and have a good rest of your week.
Thank you. You too.